Hey everybody, John here from the Esports department. We are coming up to the first group stage games for the World Championship. This is also the King of the Rift slate. For anybody involved in the King of the Rift, this is the slate for the first contest. And of course, like every single World Championship slate, it's going to be a banger. You're not going to be able to avoid bangers as far as the World Championship goes. It's just going to be good slate after good slate after good slate with all kinds of great and exciting matchups. When we get to the lineup building part, we'll go over some cash stuff and we'll talk specifically about King of the Rift. But let's go over the matchups first. First matchup on the day, Top Esports at minus 650 up against Flyquest at plus 390. This is one of the more interesting matchups of the day for me. I have Flyquest as my lowest expected ownership team on this slate, and I think Top Esports is a team that can lose. Don't get me wrong, they're a huge favorite to win this game, but if you're talking about a large field GPP, something like the $15 that's being fired that day, the 20K to first, Flyquest makes some sense to me. I think Top Esports is a beatable team, and I talked about it on the Gold Card podcast, but when you come into these events, there's almost always a few teams that the first couple times you see them play, you're just like, wow, these guys just didn't bring it. I mean, you saw it with LGD in the play-in stage. How many people really thought LGD was going to lose to Rainbow 7? Nobody. And that's going to happen in the group stage at some point. So trying to identify some spots where you can get some really good ownership, especially on a day one. Flyquest has known that they were going to be playing Top Esports for a while now. They had plenty of time to try to come up with a game plan to beat them. Oftentimes, if both teams are trying to come up with a game plan to beat the other and they both had prep time, oftentimes somebody's just going to be way off, or they're not going to be expecting what the other team prepared for them. I could definitely see any of the underdogs on these slates winning, so don't be afraid to dig into the underdogs in the World Championship. Some underdogs are going to win. Excuse me. There are going to be some upsets, and trying to get some low ownership on these 6-game slates can be really valuable. And given that, this is a matchup that should project pretty well. I think we have, see Top Esports, pretty decent projections here. Flyquest even higher than them when they win. So it's a fairly high projection matchup and a spot where you should be able to get some fairly low ownership on Flyquest. I do think Top Esports is probably your highest owned team on the slate. I think these are your bumpers as far as ownership on this slate, top and bottom. But I could definitely see reasons to go towards Flyquest here. Anybody's capable of coming up with a plan that's good, and anybody's capable of coming up with a plan that's bad, which definitely could happen with Top Esports. So Top Esports definitely a big favorite, but Flyquest certainly playable. The next matchup, Unicorns of Love against DragonX. Unicorns of Love is plus 240, DragonX at minus 345. So DragonX pretty sizable favorite. I do think that's probably correct. DragonX is a team that could get a little caught off guard by some of the more aggressive strategies that Unicorns of Love brings out. Some of the weirder stuff. I do think they're a team that's likely to get caught off guard by something like that. That said, the talent level on DragonX is just so high. It does feel a little bit hard for them to lose. I view this matchup very similarly to the first one, Top Esports and Flyquest. DragonX a big favorite to win, but Unicorns of Love is completely playable and should be a very low ownership team. I think being on some UOL could have some value. The only thing that maybe makes me want to stay away from UOL is they are just coming out of the play-ins with such impressive performances there. You might see an ownership spike on them just because of how impressive they looked coming out of the play-ins. People do have that recency bias where they like to look at somebody who was really good recently, even if it was in a completely different situation. So you could see Unicorns of Love come out here a little bit too highly owned coming off of that play-ins performance. Maybe worth staying away from them for that reason, unlike Flyquest, who I think should definitely have some insanely low ownership. Third matchup of the day, Rogue and PSG Talon. Rogue is minus 200, Talon plus 145. We talked about this on the Gold Card podcast a little bit as well, but PSG Talon is now coming in with their original lineup, River, Tank, Unified, no more Kongwei, no more D, and I think that is and no more Uniboy. And I think that is a significant change to Talon. You could argue that it's like better for them, given that this is the team that they played with all season. They should be more comfortable playing with this lineup. But I'll say in the play-ins, what made Talon stand out was Kongwei and Uniboy. Those two guys were going off together and really like sort of pseudo carrying the games. So I worry that when they go back into their original style, which is a little slower, a little more methodical, you can see their KPW DPL is pretty low compared to what they were doing in the play-ins, and part of that is because of Kongwei and Uniboy. So I worry that if they fall back into that slow, more methodic style, that will not treat them well in these group stages, and it has to be likely where they end up because it's just the kinds of players that they have. So I do like Rogue here. This matchup feels pretty avoidable. The KPW DPL for these teams is pretty low. Rogue was a must-avoid all season in the LEC. I don't see any reason to change that up here. This won't be a matchup I'm targeting, I don't think. I'm guessing, yeah, you can see it right here, just sitting right at the dead bottom for Talon and Rogue, and that's kind of what I would expect. That said, a lot of other people probably have a similar mindset to me. You could maybe bust in a couple stacks of these guys in a big GPP and hope that this just ends up being a 50-minute game that goes back and forth. Even slow teams are capable of scoring well when the game script ends up that way and they go long. So there's no reason to completely avoid the game, but it's not something that I'm looking to target for sure. So Damwon and JDG, this is the highlight matchup of day one for sure. You have the best team from Korea, arguably the best team from China. You can argue it's top esports. I personally think it's JDG. So for me, this is the best team in China against the best team in Korea playing day one. I have this as pretty much a 50-50. I'm very interested to see how it plays out. You just have such stud battles all over the map. The jungle matchup, Kanabi and Canyon. Top lane, Nugri against Zoom. I mean, even Yagao and Showmaker. It's not exactly Knight and Showmaker, but Yagao is a hell of a player. The bot lane, I think, is the only spot that's very convincingly in JDG's advantage. The mid lane, I would say, is in Damwon's advantage, but not insanely convincingly. The jungle, I would give it to JDG again, and then the top lane, I don't even want to make a pick in the top lane. Nugri and Zoom is just a nuts matchup. This feels like a game, if you were going to go with the strategy of mass multi-entering, there's a couple different ways, especially when you're in like a 20 max or something. One of the strategies that's really common is to pick a matchup that you think is going to be high scoring and then play both sides of it with a lot of different teams. This feels like a good matchup for that in a big GPP. This game could definitely be very high scoring, should be very back and forth, and I could see it definitely being in the winning lineup on the slate. Which side you want to go with, that's pretty much up to you, man. I view this matchup as pretty much a 50-50 between these two teams, and whichever one you want to go with, I wouldn't be mad at you about it. It's just a banger of a matchup, but it has the potential to be pretty high scoring. You can see in the projections, at least for the top lane, Zoom and Nuguri both in the top 3, Canyon and Kanabi both in the top 5. So pretty much no matter where you go, you're going to see these two teams showing up in like the top 5 scorers. It's just a high projection matchup, and that's what you should expect from it. The next matchup, GenG against LGD. GenG at minus 245, LGD plus 175. So we just saw LGD come out of the play-in stage. They lost 3 of their first 4 games, but then swept their playoff series to make it into the main event. GenG we haven't seen in a little while here. They were definitely a little bit more of like a volatile team in Korea versus like DragonX. I thought GenG was a little bit more volatile. This should be a battle. I think GenG is a pretty decent sized favorite. I think the minus 245 is a pretty decent number as far as estimating what their chances to win are. They have an awful lot of talent on that team in every lane, so I think they should be a big favorite. I wouldn't count LGD out here, but this does have a matchup that kind of makes me feel like it's going to end on the lower side. I haven't even looked at what the projections are for this matchup. I'm guessing they're on the lower side. GenG down here, LGD down here. So yeah, second lowest matchup. I would have just guessed that. LGD was pretty low scoring in their 2 best of 5s that they played, and have kind of been a lower scoring team for a lot of the season. And GenG's numbers, I've talked about them all season. This 18.3 kill per win and 14.6 death per loss, that's kind of rare. You don't see a lot of teams that have a really high kill per win like this and then a pretty low DPL. And I've really touted all season that their kill per win is very inflated because of a couple matchups where teams just threw an extra 5 kills at them, and it happened like 3 or 4 times. and really upped their average kill count. So I don't think GenG is really that bloody of a team, and I don't think LGD is really that bloody of a team. I don't think these guys are going to be looking to fight a lot early. This feels like a matchup you could maybe avoid, and I think GenG is one of the higher ownership teams on the slate, so it feels like a spot where maybe there's some leverage in not being involved in that matchup. Last matchup on the day, closest matchup of the day, according to the odds makers, Fnatic at -160 versus TSM at +120. So I'm known, in the company as kind of the resident TSM hater, and it's not that I hate TSM, it's actually just that I think that they were overrated because they managed to win the playoffs when they were one game away from being eliminated, and I think people forget that, before their last two series, they probably should have just lost that game against Golden Guardians. They were in a position where they were going to lose that game. They got kind of lucky that FBI made an aggressive play that they took advantage of. He flashed forward and they caught him before he could get a couple kills. If they'd stunned him even a second or two later, he would have gotten 2 kills and Golden Guardians probably would have pushed in the base and won. Instead, unfortunately for FBI, it didn't work out. They stunned him immediately pretty much and took him out. They ended up winning that series, and then they kind of pulled it together and won their next 2 series. But they were still a team that was one game away from being eliminated not long before that. And coming up against Fnatic, who beat G2 in their playoffs. Admittedly, they lost to them the next time they played them, but they beat G2. They destroyed Rogue when they played them. Fnatic is a team to be scared of. And in solo queue, we've seen the Fnatic guys are all going nuts. Selfmade has been arguably the best player on the Super server since they moved over there. The stats, we haven't talked about them in a lot of the matchups, but the stats for Fnatic are generally speaking, their gold numbers are better than TSM's playing in a much tougher league. Even the goal difference of 15 is better, and Fnatic is not a goal difference of 15 type of team for the most part. I like Fnatic to win. I think maybe it's even a little more likely than this -160 might imply. That said, TSM definitely a live underdog. Certainly, and they can win a best of 1 against Fnatic. That's right in the obvious possible results of this. I will say I think probably TSM leans on the heavier side of ownership as far as underdogs. I don't think they're going to be an underdog that's going to give you great leverage. A lot of people seem to be of the impression that TSM could come out of this group. So I think people are giving them plenty of credit, and maybe too much credit for me to want to be involved with them. I do think they're a good play in the sense that they could beat Fnatic and they're an underdog. I think they might end up being a bad play in the sense that too many people might be feeling that way. I'd rather play a team who's a little bit less likely to win, but that nobody thinks is going to win, where I can get some really good ownership, I think, rather than messing with TSM here. The Fnatic side of the matchup interests me a little bit. TSM was a little bloodier in their playoffs than they had been recently, and they had their success in the playoffs. So for me, that just means they're more likely to go back to that style of play since that's what they've been successful with. So Fnatic feels like a reasonable play. TSM feels like they might be a little bit over-owned. I pre-did my ownerships because I thought for a 6-game slate it's just tough. And this is what I came up with. Top Esports, DragonX, and GenG, the top 3, they're the teams in the easiest matchups. And all teams that are at least reasonable in the scoring realm, so people are going to be willing to play them. I think Damwon Gaming comes in next. I think if Damwon Gaming was in any other matchup, they would be one of the highest owned teams on the slate. They dropped down to 4th because I think a reasonable number of people are going to be willing to take JDG against them. And then I put both Fnatic and TSM in between Damwon and JDG. I think both sides of that matchup should get some ownership, and I have TSM being one of the higher owned underdogs, even higher owned than one of the favorites in Rogue. Rogue and Talon I have down here. I think most people are going to recognize that this is a low-scoring matchup that they don't want to be involved with. And so even the favorite from that matchup, I have a significantly lower on the ownerships. At the bottom, LGD, UOL, and Flyquest, the 3 teams who have the lowest chance of winning. I think people will just avoid those teams, which makes sense to me. I could see UOL being higher than LGD because of their performance in the play-ins. But LGD also 6-0'd. They 6-0'd their playoffs, so I think people were more impressed with UOL than they were with LGD. So I could see UOL being higher than LGD, but I do think those are probably your 3 lowest ownership teams. Let's look at the favorites and their possible scoring. So it would be GenG, Fnatic, Damwon, Rogue, Top Esports, and DragonX. See where we would expect to get our points from the favorites. Damwon Gaming grading out the highest in the top lane, followed by Top, Fnatic, DragonX, GenG, and Rogue, and I think we're going to see GenG and Rogue at the bottom quite a bit. GenG and Rogue also in the jungle. Self-made actually down there for Fnatic. This is a projection that, while it's correct numerically, I may be a little bit more likely to see him move up a little bit. I think he's gotten a lot more agency with the team recently. They've been much more willing to kind of unleash him, and he's done so well on the Super server that I wouldn't be surprised if some of their game plans for this tournament focused around kind of destroying Spica, the newer member of TSM, somebody that they could certainly take advantage of. I could see Fnatic crafting a game plan to get Self-made on something that can carry and really bully Spica around. So maybe Self-made projects a little bit better than this. At the top, it's actually Pyosik, number 1, which is surprising. I wouldn't expect the Korean teams to outscore the Chinese teams on average. So when I see one up there, that tells me a lot about what their opponent gives up. UOL gives up an awful lot of points. So DRX sitting up towards the top there. In the mid lane, Knight on top, which I think you should expect to see on every slate where Knight plays. He's just like the best fantasy player in the world, basically. Damwon Gaming in second, DRX third, then Rogue and GenG at the second to bottom, Nemesis in last. So if you're playing those Fnatic stacks, it's been true all season, but Nemesis is probably the guy to avoid. Whippo tends to score pretty well out of the top lane. Nemesis one of the weaker scorers in the mid lane. Going to AD carry, it's top esports again, GenG and DragonX in the next 2 spots, and then the same 3 teams we're seeing show up at the bottom a lot, Fnatic, Damwon, and Rogue, all generally showing up down there, with top esports and the Korean teams up here. The bad part about that is you're seeing the best projections for the teams that we project to have the highest ownerships, which kind of sucks. It just means that people are most likely to be playing the right teams. At support, it's DRX on top again with Keria, and then Yuyanja, Beryl, and then GenG, Fnatic, and Rogue at the bottom again, as expected. So it is the 2 Korean teams and the Chinese team, top esports anyway, that is high on the projection list. And that's kind of what we would have predicted from looking at the KPWs and DPLs. A little bit unfortunate that we don't get to see something weird where like a Fnatic was up here and somebody that might be a little bit lower owned was someone that we could take advantage of, but such is how it goes. For possible cash lineups, if we were looking at cash, and this is where King of the Rift is going to be relevant as well, since King of the Rift is essentially a cash tournament for the first couple rounds, the biggest favorites would have to be DragonX, top, GenG's pretty reasonable, so let's see, we could do DragonX, top GenG. Sorry if you're getting any background noise there. There's a Zoom call going on in the other room that's pretty loud. And GenG DRX. Nobody else really coming out with the kind of odds. Maybe Rogue. I don't think you really want to mess with Rogue for this one, though. We could maybe have a look at it if they're cheaper. How cheap is Rogue comparatively to those teams? The cheapest favorite. So yeah, maybe you want to take a look at Rogue DRX or Rogue top just to see what that comes up with. So let's start with DRX and top esports. Nothing, huh? Let me make sure I'm not missing a setting here. We can use DragonX team. I don't know why that was marked out. Nothing, huh? So even if we played like top esports team with DragonX, I just want to see if there's a mistake in this or not. Jackie's a full 600 more, so we're gonna have to play Deft. Where's the cheapest difference? That's a full 6. 400 there, so maybe we could play Karsa. So if you played all DragonX, it would fit. But even, yeah, trying to get... You can't even play team captain with those guys. What about top and GenG? Unable, huh? Oh, wait, when I was doing that other lineup... I might have made a mistake on the other one, but let's try this real quick. GenG with top. 400 gap to Rascal, 600 gap down to Clid, a 400 gap to BDD, 400 gap to Jackie, 800 gap to Life. So you definitely want to be on Life. But then you'd have to upgrade either Ruler, which would be 400, 600. So these teams can't even be played together either. Holy crap. You can't get top Esports and GenG even. What about GenG and DRX? I didn't realize the cash was so limited that you couldn't even play team captains. You can get a 195.7 out of DragonX and GenG. I guess, I mean, it seems like this is going to be probably the standard cash lineup, something like this, given that you can't get top esports with either of those teams. What happens if you... Let's have a look at some rogues, just because the lack of possible lineups with these other teams. What about top esports and rogue? You can do that, but at the expectation isn't even really that high, 190.2. Do rogue and DRX, 196.4. What about rogue GenG? 190.1. So I mean, really, it just leans you to the GenG DRX. The rogue DRX has just a slightly higher expectation, 0.7 higher expectation, but you're taking on a lot of additional risk playing rogue versus playing GenG and DRX. So it makes too much sense to me to just stick with GenG and DRX as your main cash lineup. And probably something you will see from me at least once in the King of the Rift, maybe more than once. You get Doran captain with Piosik, Chovy, Deft, Rascal, and Life is the highest projection version of the lineup. It's a little scary. Life is super cheap, which is probably why it's doing this. He's 400 cheaper, where all the other positions are 200 cheaper, and this maxes out the salary, so this is probably the only way that this lineup can happen. You could play a support captain, and then you wouldn't have to play this exact setup, but you're still going to end up with Life. So Life probably going to be insanely highly owned in things like the King of the Rift and in cash games. But it's hard not to be on this combination. I think this is a pretty good combination to be on. Something like Rogue and Top Esports is another way you could go with it if you wanted to get away from some of these teams, but this just makes a lot of sense to me. I don't think you can really mess with Damwon JDG in cash. I don't think you can really mess with TSM Fnatic in cash. Talon and Rogue is about the sketchiest matchup that I'm willing to look at as far as cash games go. So hopefully that's a decent prep for day one, guys. I haven't made my lineups yet, so I want to go make them right after this video. I have some thoughts now. And good luck to us all. I'll do a King of the Rift update after day one, posting who's left in, how many people still have 3, how many people still have 2, how many people still have 1, all that kind of stuff on Twitter to keep an update there. And good luck to us all, man. Let's get through this thing, huh? I appreciate you guys, and have a good one.